A cocky salesman at a high-end motorcycle dealership thought he had the upper hand, mocking, belittling, and even slapping a brochure onto a customer's chest. But what he didn't know, the man he just humiliated wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the entire dealership. And when the truth hit, the power shifted instantly. No shouting, no threats, just pure, silent revenge. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq stepped into the dealership, his broad frame casting a shadow across the showroom floor. The place smelled of polished leather and engine oil, the air thick with the hum of casual conversations and business deals. Dressed in a simple hoodie, basketball shorts, and sneakers, he looked like any other guy browsing for a motorcycle. No diamond chains, no security detail, just him. Employees barely gave him a second glance. He wasn't the usual customer dripping in wealth, flashing credit cards before even asking about specs. That's how they liked their buyers: predictable, easy to upsell, eager to be impressed. Shaq, however, wasn't here for their approval. He was here to test them. A salesman, mid-30s, sharp suit but with an arrogance that clung to him like cheap cologne, leaned against a sleek black motorcycle. His name tag read, Travis. His eyes flicked over Shaq, calculating, judging. Then came the smirk. Shaq ran his fingers along the glossy finish of a limited edition bike. "Nice ride," he said, voice calm. "What's the asking price on this one?" Travis barely concealed his amusement. "Oh, this one? You're looking at close to $60,000. Shaq nodded, inspecting the details. 60, huh? What's under the hood?" Travis exhaled sharply, exchanging a glance with another employee, a silent joke passing between them. "Not sure that matters, big guy. Most people asking about this bike either ride as a hobby or, well, they can actually afford it." A chuckle rippled through the showroom. A few customers paused their browsing to eavesdrop. Shaq, however, didn't flinch. "Right," he said, playing along. "But humor me. What kind of horsepower are we talking?" Travis tilted his head, debating whether to engage. 1,500 cc, liquid-cooled V-twin, 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. He folded his arms. "Not exactly a starter bike." Shaq nodded, running a hand along the seat. "And if I wanted to test ride it?" Travis laughed outright this time. "We don't just let anyone take these for a spin. Company policy." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Even if I'm serious about buying?" Travis let the question hang. Then, as if sealing the conversation, he reached for a brochure from the counter and slapped it onto Shaq's chest. "You can start with this," he said. "Might be more in your range." Silence. A few customers shuffled awkwardly. One of the junior employees looked nervous, sensing the tension that had thickened in the room. Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing down at the brochure before letting it slip from his hands onto the floor. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he met Travis's gaze. Calm, unreadable. "Let me talk to the owner," he said simply. Travis's smirk widened. "Oh man, that's a good one." He looked around, inviting others into the joke. "You want to take this up with the owner? What, you gonna tell on me?" A few muffled chuckles. Shaq remained still. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." The laughter in the dealership grew louder, blending with the faint revving of an engine from the service bay. Travis, the salesman, stood with his arms crossed, reveling in the moment. His smirk widened as he looked Shaq up and down, still convinced the man before him was nothing more than a time waster, a guy looking to entertain himself by pretending to buy something he couldn't afford. Shaq didn't react. His expression remained unreadable, calm. He tilted his head slightly, as if he were considering something, then gestured toward the bike again. "What's the warranty like on this model?" His voice was smooth, collected. Travis let out an exaggerated sigh, as if exhausted by the mere thought of engaging any further. "You're still on this?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, big guy, since you're so interested." He turned toward the growing audience of customers, playing to them now, as if he were putting on a show. "See, this bike? Top-tier craftsmanship, but for people who actually ride, not just dream about it." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Shaq didn't take the bait. "And the financing options?" he asked casually. Travis raised a brow. He was enjoying this too much now. "Oh, financing?" He dragged the word out mockingly. "Yeah, we've got plans, but let's be real. You'd need at least a decent credit score to qualify for anything worth your time." The laughter grew. A couple of onlookers shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with how far Travis was taking it. Still, Shaq stayed composed. He nodded, thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering the insult. "Good to know," he said, his voice steady. "So, what's the APR on a full cash payment?" That wiped the smirk off Travis's face, just for a second. But he recovered quickly. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping to something between a whisper and a taunt. "Oh, come on, man," he said. "Why don't we skip this whole back and forth? You don't need numbers, you need reality." He reached behind him, grabbing another brochure, this one featuring a much cheaper, lower-end model. With a deliberate flick of his wrist, he smacked it against Shaq's chest. "You can start with this one." The paper slid to the floor. Silence. The laughter stopped. The energy in the room shifted, suddenly thick, suddenly tense. Even the employees who had been entertained by Travis's antics moments ago now glanced at each other, unsure. Shaq didn't move. He just looked down at the fallen brochure. The polished floors reflected his towering frame. Travis, still feeling dominant, smirked. "See? Here's the thing, big guy," he continued, tone smug. "You can't just walk in here, act like you own the place, and expect to be taken seriously." Shaq exhaled slowly, finally lifting his gaze to meet Travis's. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten. His presence alone was enough. And then, in a tone so calm it sent a chill through the room, he said, "I'd like to speak to the owner." Travis burst out laughing. "The owner?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Oh, that's Rich." A couple of customers exchanged wary glances. Something about Shaq's presence, the way he stood, the way he spoke, made it clear that this wasn't just some ordinary man. But Travis wasn't backing down. He was too deep now. He turned to one of the employees at the front desk. "Hey, Sarah," he called, voice dripping with amusement. "Get the boss, will ya? We got someone who really wants to speak to him." Sarah hesitated. She glanced at Shaq, something in her eyes betraying recognition. Unlike Travis, she knew exactly who was standing in front of them. Travis rolled his eyes. "Come on, Sarah. Don't make the man wait." Still hesitant, Sarah picked up the phone and made the call. A few minutes passed. The room remained uncomfortably quiet. Travis was still smirking, hands in his pockets, weight shifted to one side like he was about to witness the final punchline to his joke. And then the door to the manager's office opened. A well-dressed man stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. He was older, late 50s, with graying hair and the look of someone who had seen it all in this business. "All right," he said, stepping forward. "Who wants to talk to me?" Shaq turned, finally breaking his gaze from Travis, and extended a hand. "Good to see you again, Jonathan." The manager froze. His eyes locked onto Shaq, then widened in recognition. All the color drained from his face. The tension in the room thickened like a storm about to break. Travis, still oblivious, crossed his arms, glancing at the general manager like they were about to share a joke at Shaq's expense. The manager, a stocky man in his early 50s named Richard Langley, adjusted his blazer and approached with a smirk. He had the air of someone who'd talked his way out of worse situations. "So," Richard said, looking Shaq up and down, "I hear you're demanding to speak to the owner." Pretty bold move considering how this all started. His voice was smooth but condescending, the kind of tone that suggested he already thought he had the upper hand. What exactly seems to be the problem? Shaq exhaled slowly, his massive hands resting at his sides. The room was so quiet that even the soft hum of an idling motorcycle in the corner felt deafening. "The problem," Shaq said, voice even, "is that your employee just made the worst mistake of his career." Richard let out a short chuckle. "Oh, come on. Travis might be a little..." He shot the salesman a glance. "Direct, but he's one of my best. If you're upset because he hurt your feelings, we can get you a coupon or something." Laughter rippled through a few of the customers. Some still weren't sure whether this was real or just some elaborate prank. Shaq remained unmoved. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped a single contact, and lifted it to his ear. His voice, calm and controlled, carried across the showroom. "Bring him in." The entire room seemed to inhale at once. Richard's smirk faltered. Travis shifted uncomfortably, his confidence flickering for the first time. A few seconds later, the unmistakable rumble of a high-powered engine echoed from outside. A black SUV rolled up to the dealership's entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the showroom lights. Every set of eyes in the building locked onto it as the door swung open. A man in a dark suit stepped out, crisp and precise, carrying a leather-bound folder. His polished shoes clicked against the tile as he strode toward Shaq and handed him the documents, with a quiet nod. Shaq flipped the folder open, his eyes scanning the first few lines. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned it around and held it up for Richard to see. "This," Shaq said, his voice steady, "is my dealership." Silence. A few customers gasped. An employee near the front desk dropped the pen she had been holding. Richard's face lost all color. He blinked at the papers, his mouth opening slightly before shutting again. Travis, standing frozen next to him, looked like he had just been punched in the gut. Shaq let the words sink in before he continued. "I don't think you heard me the first time. This dealership, you work for me now." The energy in the room flipped completely. Customers who had laughed moments ago were now staring at Shaq in wide-eyed realization. Employees exchanged nervous glances. The shift in power was undeniable, irreversible. Richard swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle that barely masked his growing panic. "Wait a second. This has got to be some kind of—" "No mistake," the suited man interjected. "The transfer was finalized last month. Mr. O'Neill is the majority owner." Richard's jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward Travis, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. Shaq took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. His voice never rose, but the weight of it made the air in the room feel heavier. "So tell me, Richard, do I look like someone who needs a financing plan?" The question hung between them, a blade waiting to drop. Richard forced a tight smile. "Of course not. I mean, obviously I didn't realize who you were. If I had known—" Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's the thing, isn't it?" He turned slightly, glancing around the room. "You didn't know. Because you judged me the second I walked in here." Travis, still frozen, tried to shrink away, but Shaq's eyes locked onto him. "And you," Shaq said, his voice carrying across the showroom, "thought it was fun to humiliate a customer because you assumed he was beneath you." Travis stammered, his cocky demeanor shattered. I wasn't trying to—" Shaq let the moment stretch, then turned back to Richard. "Tell me, Richard, what do you think I should do with an employee who disrespects my customers?" Richard swallowed. His forehead glistened under the showroom lights. I can discipline him, of course. A warning, maybe." Shaq shook his head. "No warnings." He paused, then added, "Let's make this simple. Travis, you've got two choices." Travis stiffened. "One," Shaq continued, "you walk out that door, and I make sure you never work in a dealership like this again." The blood drained from Travis's face. "Or two." Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words feel heavier. "You start from the bottom, sales floor, no commission for the first month, and every customer you deal with, you treat them like royalty." Travis opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His pride was screaming at him to walk away, but he wasn't stupid. If Shaq meant what he said, if he really owned this place, then that meant his reputation in the industry was at risk. Richard, still shaken, turned to Travis, giving him a small nod that said, "You don't have a choice." Travis swallowed. I'll take option 2. Shaq studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good choice." The energy in the room had shifted completely. Employees who had once seen Travis as untouchable now looked at him differently. Customers who had been entertained by his arrogance now saw him for what he was, a man who had just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Shaq turned back to Richard. "And as for you," he said, "you better hope there's nothing else in this dealership that needs cleaning up." Richard nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. O'Neill. Absolutely. Shaq let the weight of the moment settle before he finally stepped back. He turned, giving one last glance to the motorcycle that had started it all. Now, he said, let's talk about that bike. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. Permanently. Shaq didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to throw a punch. His presence alone was enough to dismantle the arrogance that had filled the room just moments ago. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, towering over Travis without effort. His eyes locked onto the salesman's. There was no rage in them, no outburst, just an unnerving stillness. So tell me. Shaq's voice was low, controlled. What were you saying about affording this bike? Travis opened his mouth, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly, as if hoping the moment would just reset itself. But it wouldn't. The customers who had laughed at Shaq before were now watching the scene with wide eyes. The employees who had looked the other way when Travis mocked him now avoided his gaze. The entire energy in the dealership had shifted. Shaq exhaled slowly, and for a brief moment, the world around him faded. The polished floors of the dealership blurred, and suddenly, he wasn't standing in a luxury showroom anymore. He was 12. The smell of hot asphalt filled his nose, the summer heat bouncing off the cracked pavement of a Florida playground. His oversized sneakers scuffed against the ground as he walked toward the basketball hoop, gripping the ball tighter than necessary. A group of boys stood near the free throw line, their voices sharp and cutting. "You think just 'cause you're big you can play?" One of them sneered. He was shorter, faster, and full of something Shaq had seen his whole life: doubt. Shaq didn't respond. He just dribbled the ball once, then twice. "Man, I bet you can't even shoot." Another boy laughed. "All that size and no skill." More laughter. Shaq clenched his jaw. He wanted to prove them wrong. He wanted to show them. But then, his mother's voice cut through the noise. Not from the sidelines, not out loud, but from a memory buried deep inside him. The most powerful man in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. His grip on the ball loosened. He didn't need to prove anything. Instead of shooting, Shaq turned and walked off the court, the sound of jeers echoing behind him. He didn't care. He knew his time would come. The dealership snapped back into focus. The polished floors, the expensive motorcycles, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Shaq's mother had been right. He had never needed to prove himself to anyone. He watched Travis, who was still frozen in place, unable to meet his gaze. "You know what your problem is?" Shaq said finally. His voice wasn't angry, just cold. "You think power is about control, about being the loudest guy in the room." Travis swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "But real power?" Shaq continued. "It's knowing you don't have to say a thing to own the moment." Travis shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't laughing anymore. Shaq let the words settle before he took a step back, finally breaking the suffocating tension. His gaze flickered toward Richard, the general manager, who stood motionless, still trying to process what had just happened. "You have employees like him running this place," Shaq said, nodding toward Travis. "That's why it's my dealership now." Richard didn't argue. He didn't even breathe. Shaq let out a small exhale, shaking his head before glancing at the bike that had started it all. His hand ran across the seat, his fingers dragging over the smooth leather. Then, without another word, he turned toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, a voice, weak, hesitant, called out, "Wait." It was Travis. The salesman looked wrecked, his earlier bravado stripped away, leaving only the raw, vulnerable shell of a man who had just lost everything. Shaq didn't turn around. He just waited. Travis cleared his throat. I was wrong," he said, voice hoarse. "About you. About everything." The dealership was silent. No one interrupted. No one laughed. For the first time that day, Travis wasn't putting on a show. "I judged you," he admitted, eyes downcast. "And I got caught." He hesitated, exhaling. "But if I hadn't, I probably wouldn't have learned a damn thing." Shaq finally turned, his expression unreadable. Travis swallowed again. "I don't expect you to believe me, but I'll do better." The words lingered, Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't approval. But it was acknowledgement. Travis had lost the battle. But maybe, just maybe, he had learned the lesson. And that was enough. With that, Shaq stepped outside, the glass doors reflecting his towering figure. The sun hit his skin as he exhaled, his past and present colliding in the most unexpected way. And then, without looking back, he walked toward his next move. Richard, the general manager, cleared his throat, trying to salvage whatever authority he had left. "Mr. O'Neill, listen, I think—" Shaq lifted a hand. Not a threatening move, not aggressive, just a small, quiet gesture. Richard froze. Shaq wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted this moment, this exact excruciating moment, to stretch as long as possible. The silence was louder than any outburst could ever be. Customers who had once smirked at Travis's antics now stood awkwardly, some pulling out their phones, recording discreetly. Employees shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement now replaced with secondhand shame. Even Sarah, the receptionist who had recognized Shaq, sat still, watching with wide eyes. Travis, still frozen in place, exhaled shakily. His shoulders had dropped, his previous arrogance completely drained. He had no words, no defense. Nothing. Shaq, slow and deliberate, bent down and picked up the fallen brochure, the same one Travis had slapped out of his hands earlier. He studied it for a moment. The glossy cover reflected the overhead lights. Then, without a word, he extended it back to Travis. "Start." Over Travis's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His shaking hand reached out, barely able to take the paper from Shaq's grip. Travis hesitated, looking at the brochure like it was a loaded weapon. "I don't—" Shaq raised an eyebrow. Travis's mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent years mastering the art of fast talk, of using charm and confidence to control conversations. But now, none of that mattered. Shaq wasn't just standing in front of him. He was towering over him, not just in size, but in presence. "Go ahead," Shaq said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Sell me the bike." Travis's lips parted slightly. His mind raced, but there was nowhere to run. Customers watched, waiting. The phones stayed raised, capturing every moment. He licked his lips, his mouth suddenly dry. This model," he stammered, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain some semblance of professionalism. "This is a 1,500 cubic centimeter, liquid-cooled, V-twin engine." Shaq nodded, arms crossed. "Go on." Travis swallowed again, staring at the brochure like it held the answers to a test he hadn't studied for. "It's, built for high performance, with a lightweight frame for, optimal handling." His voice was barely above a whisper now. The humiliation was suffocating him. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Shaq let the silence stretch again before tilting his head. "What's the top speed?" Travis opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no idea. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered, low enough that only those closest to him could hear. "You work here, right?" Travis flinched like he had been slapped. Shaq glanced at Richard. "This is the guy you trust to run your sales floor?" Richard, for the first time, had no smirk, no empty words. He just stood there, sweating through his expensive suit. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then, with the smallest smile, one that wasn't cruel, but wasn't exactly kind either, he turned to the rest of the dealership. "Anybody else want to help me?" His voice was light, teasing. "I just want to buy a bike." A chuckle came from somewhere in the crowd. Shaq let the moment settle before looking back at Travis. "You see what's happening here?" Travis's breathing was uneven. His fingers clutched the brochure so tightly it crumpled slightly at the edges. "You wanted me to feel small," Shaq said, voice low and steady. "Now look at you." Travis blinked rapidly, his gaze dropping to the floor. Shaq let out a soft, disappointed sigh, then turned to Richard. "You've got a problem here," he said. Richard straightened, fumbling for words. Mr. O'Neill, I assure you, this is not how we treat—" Shaq held up a hand again. I didn't ask for an apology. His voice remained calm, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. I asked if you're going to fix it. Richard nodded so fast it was almost desperate. Absolutely. I'll... Shaq's gaze cut to Travis. Richard followed the look and understood immediately. He turned to the salesman, his tone suddenly sharp. Travis, my office. Now. Travis hesitated, his pride still holding on by a thread. But then his shoulders dropped, and with a quiet, "Yes, sir," he turned and walked toward the back. Shaq watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then, shaking his head slightly, he turned back to the bike, the one he had been interested in from the start. Now, he said, this time addressing a different, younger employee. You mind actually helping me with this? The younger salesman, nervous but eager, stepped forward immediately. Yes, sir. Absolutely. And just like that, the moment passed. The power had shifted, and Shaq never had to raise his voice. The weight of humiliation clung to Travis like a wet coat, suffocating and inescapable. His fingers trembled as they gripped the crumpled brochure, his knuckles whitening. The confidence, the smirking, arrogant salesman who had humiliated Shaq just minutes ago, was gone. In his place stood a man drowning in his own downfall. Shaq stood motionless, arms crossed over his chest, watching. No outburst, no gloating. He didn't need to raise his voice because silence was doing the job just fine. Travis swallowed hard and finally lifted the brochure to eye level. He blinked rapidly, trying to steady himself. He cleared his throat, but it didn't help. When he spoke, his voice wavered. This bike, he coughed, starting over. This is a high-performance touring model, designed for riders looking for a combination of power and comfort. His words trailed off as he struggled to focus. Shaq remained still, giving nothing away. Travis exhaled, blinking down at the words on the page. It's got a 1500cc, liquid-cooled V-twin engine, capable of hitting... He hesitated. The specs blurred in front of him. Hitting 0 to 60 in... He stopped. He had forgotten. Travis's hands twitched as he frantically skimmed the page, but nothing registered. The pressure of all those eyes, employees, customers, his own, boss, was too much. He could feel the phone still recording, capturing every second of his downfall. Shaq tilted his head slightly. What's the horsepower? Travis swallowed, his lips parting, but the answer wouldn't come. Shaq's eyebrow lifted. The weight? Travis's breathing turned shallow. The moment stretched. Shaq sighed and leaned forward just a little. You sell bikes for a living, don't you? Travis's lips pressed into a tight line. His shoulders had dropped, the last of his pride slipping from his body like air leaking from a punctured tire. Finally he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I judged you. The words hung in the air. Travis inhaled shakily and kept going. I thought you were just another guy wasting my time. He shook his head, eyes dropping to the floor. I figured you couldn't afford it, that you didn't belong here. Shaq's expression didn't change. And now? Travis looked up, meeting Shaq's gaze for the first time since this all began. His face was pale, the sweat on his forehead glistening under the dealership's bright lights. Now I know I was wrong, he admitted. About you. About everything. A heavy silence followed. Shaq watched him, his eyes unreadable. He had already won. Travis was standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance, and Shaq didn't need to kick a man who was already on his knees. Richard, the general manager, cleared his throat, stepping forward hesitantly. Mr. O'Neill, he started, attempting to salvage what little authority he had left. I hope we can... Shaq didn't look at him. Instead, he took the crumpled brochure from Travis's shaking hands. He straightened it out, smoothing the creases with deliberate patience. Then, he handed it back. Try again, Shaq said. Travis hesitated, but there was no way out. His voice was still weak, but this time there was something different. The arrogance was gone. The ego was gone. This is one of our most powerful models, he said. It's built for riders who want speed, but also reliability. He swallowed. The 1500cc engine delivers a smooth ride, and the custom suspension makes it comfortable for long distances. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't confident. But it was real. Shaq nodded slightly. Better. Travis exhaled like he had been holding his breath for hours. Shaq finally turned to Richard, his tone even. I don't care what happens to him, he said, nodding toward Travis. That's your decision. Richard flinched slightly, but nodded. Understood. Mr. O'Neill. Shaq held his gaze for a moment longer before finally stepping back. The moment had passed. The lesson had been learned. And Travis? He would never forget it. At the center of it all was Travis, sweating, humiliated, stripped of the arrogance he had worn like a shield. His hands, still gripping the brochure, trembled slightly. The man who had commanded the sales floor with his smug confidence now looked lost, like a rookie on his first day. Shaq studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He had already won. The question now was what to do with the victory. He could fire him. That would be easy. The simplest solution. But easy wasn't always right. Shaq tilted his head slightly. You got two choices, he said, his voice calm but firm. Travis inhaled sharply, bracing himself. Shaq took a slow step forward. 1. You walk out that door right now. He nodded toward the entrance. You leave, and I make sure you never work in a dealership like this again. Travis's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Or 2. Shaq continued, voice steady. You stay. But if you do, things change. You change. Travis's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Shaq's voice was unshakable. No more judgment. No more ego. You treat every customer like they matter. He let the words settle. Because they do. Travis exhaled shakily, his pride screaming at him to refuse, to fight back, to walk away with whatever dignity he had left. But where would he go? If he left now, he'd walk into nothing. No dealership would touch him once Shaq made the call. His reputation, once built on dominance, was now in Shaq's hands. He looked around, seeing his coworkers watching, waiting. Some pitied him. Some didn't. But none of them would save him. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched. Then, finally, his head dipped just slightly. Yes, sir. The words barely made it out. They tasted bitter, foreign. But he had no choice. Shaq didn't react right away. He let the silence stretch, making sure Travis understood exactly what this moment meant. Then, with a slight nod, he turned to Richard, the manager, who stood stiffly, still shaken. Put him back on the floor, Shaq said. But he starts at the bottom. Richard, eager to stay in Shaq's good graces, nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. O'Neill. Consider it done. Shaq's gaze flickered back to Travis. Don't waste this, he said simply. Travis didn't dare look up. I won't. Shaq let out a slow breath, finally breaking the tension in the room. Then turning away from the shattered salesman, he walked toward the bike that had started it all. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted, permanently. The dealership wasn't the same anymore. The moment Shaq had walked out that day, something shifted in the air, something unspoken, yet powerful. Employees whispered in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Customers picked up on the tension, sensing the undercurrent of change. The once dominant salesman, Travis, had been knocked off his pedestal. And now? He was reporting to the very man he had humiliated. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but a slow, steady unraveling of everything Travis had built his career on. His arrogance, his sharp tongue, his ability to control the room with nothing but an insincere grin and a condescending laugh. All of it had crumbled, and in its place, something new was being forced to grow. Shaq didn't make a big show of it. That wasn't his style. Instead, he made a habit of walking in, dressed the same way as before, in hoodies and sneakers, no flashy jewelry, no entourage, no announcement, no warning. He would simply appear, strolling through the dealership like any other customer, hands in his pockets, nodding at employees as he passed. And every time, without fail, Travis was the first to notice. The first time Shaq returned, Travis had been standing behind the counter, staring at the computer screen but not really seeing it. The second he caught a glimpse of that familiar towering frame in his peripheral vision, his breath hitched. His body went rigid. But he didn't run. Not this time. Instead, he straightened his posture, exhaled through his nose, and forced himself to do what he had never done before. Pay attention. "Good afternoon, sir," Travis greeted, voice steady but controlled. "Welcome back." Shaq paused, tilting his head slightly. He didn't respond right away. Employees stopped what they were doing. Conversations slowed. A few customers, unaware of the history, simply browsed the showroom floor, oblivious to the tension thickening in the air. Shaq stepped closer. "How's business?" he asked, voice smooth, unreadable. Travis swallowed but held his ground. "Stronger than ever," he admitted. "We've been working on things." Shaq nodded slowly, letting the words hang for a moment before shifting his gaze toward a couple browsing one of the higher-end models. The way Travis had treated people before, dismissing them, making snap judgments, deciding in an instant who was worthy of his time. Shaq wondered if he had truly changed. And then, Shaq watched. Travis inhaled, straightened his shoulders, and approached the couple. "Good afternoon," he said, voice calm, even welcoming. "Looking for something specific today?" The man hesitated, exchanging a glance with his wife. "Just browsing," he said cautiously. Travis nodded. "Of course. Take your time, and if you have any questions, I'll be right here." His tone lacked the arrogance it once carried, the barely veiled condescension. It was genuine, respectful. Shaq watched as the couple visibly relaxed, no longer feeling like they had to prove themselves. Travis had learned. Not because someone had yelled at him, not because he had been fired, because he had been forced to sit in his own humiliation and understand what it felt like to be on the other side. And that was real justice. Shaq didn't need revenge. He had something better. He had proof that power, real power, wasn't about how loud you could be. It wasn't about how many people feared you. It was about the impact you left behind. And as Shaq turned to leave, passing by Travis without another word, he knew. He had already won. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the glass windows of the dealership. The air inside buzzed softly with the usual sounds of a showroom, faint conversations, the clicking of shoes against polished floors, and the subtle hum of high-performance engines waiting to be taken home. Then, without announcement, without spectacle, he walked in. Shaq. Same hoodie. Same sneakers. Same effortless stride. But this time, the air shifted in a different way. Employees no longer ignored him. Customers didn't give him second glances, wondering if he belonged. They knew. This wasn't just another man browsing for a motorcycle. This was the man who owned the place. And as he moved through the showroom, past the endless rows of gleaming machines, his steps slowed. His eyes settled on the same bike that had started it all, the one that Travis had mocked him for even considering. The dealership was silent now, as if holding its breath. Employees whispered to each other, but no one moved. Then one man stepped forward, Travis. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of respect. His posture was different now, straighter, but not stiff. His expression, once smug and dismissive, now held something else, a quiet understanding, a lesson learned. He stopped beside the bike, hands folded in front of him. He didn't stammer. He didn't hesitate. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice steady. "Would you like me to go over the specs?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He simply studied Travis, his face unreadable. Then slowly, a small smile formed. "No need," Shaq said. He already knew. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, then handed over his black card. "I'll take it." A slow ripple of realization spread through the room. Some customers gasped, employees straightened, their eyes wide. This was the moment. This was the ultimate silent flex. No speech, no lecture, no revenge-fueled outburst. Just a man buying the very thing he was once told he couldn't afford, without a second thought. Travis swallowed and nodded. He carefully took the card and turned toward the counter, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood the gravity of this moment. Minutes later, the paperwork was done. Shaq slid his hands across the handlebars, feeling the cool steel beneath his fingertips. The keys were his. The bike was his. And then, he rode. As the doors of the dealership opened, the roar of the engine filled the air. Heads turned. People stopped what they were doing, drawn toward the sound like it was some kind of final verdict. Shaq didn't look back. He didn't need to. He just rode out, leaving behind a lesson, a legacy, and a silence louder than words. And Travis? He watched as Shaq disappeared down the road, knowing he had just lived through the most unforgettable lesson of his life. Some lessons hit harder than words. Some power moves are made in silence. Think twice before judging the next person who walks through the door. You never know who really owns the room. Want more stories that flip the script and challenge expectations? Stay ready. The next one might just change the game.